for stonewalling, in which the listener simply withdraws, refusing to talk or even stay in the same room. In the discussion that follows, I want to propose an alternative to this fruitless and usually endless style of arguing. Imagine, if you will, the following scenario: Phil and Alice are washing the dishes. They have had several friends over for dinner, the friends have left, and Phil and Alice are cleaning up. During the evening, Alice was her usual charming, witty, vivacious self. But Phil, who is usually delighted by her charm, is feeling hurt and a little angry. It seems that, during a political discussion, Alice had disagreed with his position and sided with Tom. Moreover, she seemed to express a great deal of warmth toward Tom in the course of the evening. In fact, her behavior was flirtatious. Phil is thinking, I love her so much. I wish she wouldn't do things like that. Maybe she's losing interest in me. God, if she ever left me, I don't know what I'd do. Is she really attracted to Tom? But Phil is reluctant to share his vulnerability, so he says, You sure? We're throwing yourself at Tom tonight. Everybody noticed it. You really made a fool of yourself. Alice loves philosophy. She felt that she had said some very bright things that evening, especially during the political discussion, and felt that Phil didn't acknowledge her intellectual contribution. He thinks I'm just an uninteresting housewife. He is probably bored with me. The following conversation ensues. Alice, I don't know what you're talking about. You're just mad because I happen to disagree with you about the president's tax proposal. Tom saw it my way. I think I was right. Phil, he saw it your way. Are you kidding? What else could he do? You were practically sitting in his lap. The other guests were embarrassed. Alice, why, Phil, I do believe you're jealous. Phil, I'm not jealous. I really don't give a damn. If you want to act like a slut, that's your business. Alice, boy, are you old-fashioned? You're talking like some Victorian, for God's sake. You're always doing that. Phil, that just shows how little you know about me. I'm more of a feminist than you are. The women I work with think I'm great. Alice, yeah, I'm sure all the women at your office really are hot for you. Phil, now, what's that supposed to mean? Alice falls into a stony silence. Phil makes several attempts to get a response from her, fails, and then storms out of the room, slamming the door. What is going on? Here are two people who love each other. How did they get into such a vicious, wounding argument? One of the major characteristics that separate humans from other organisms is our ability to communicate complex information. Our language gives us truly awesome powers of conversation, yet misunderstandings are frequent, even in relationships that are close and caring. Though hypothetical, the argument I wrote between Phil and Alice is not unrealistic, rather, it is typical of hundreds of such conversations I have heard as a consultant trying to help couples straighten out their garbled, indirect, and misleading ways of talking to each other. Phil and Alice each had a major concern, but neither was able or willing to state it in a straightforward way. For Alice, the major concern was her intellectual competence. She was afraid Phil thought she was dumb or boring. Her implicit complaint in this argument was that Phil didn't acknowledge the cogency of her statements during the political discussion, and he seemed to be implying that the only reason Tom paid attention to her was sexual attraction. As a result, Phil's comments hurt her, threatened her self-esteem, and made her angry. She didn't express the hurt, however. Alice expressed the anger, but not by revealing it. Rather, she took the offensive and attacked Phil by implying that he is stodgy and uninteresting. Phil's major concern stemmed from a different feeling of insecurity. Although he enjoys Alice's vivacity, he is afraid of the possibility that, with increasing age, he is losing his own sexual attractiveness. Thus, he assumed that Alice's agreeing with Tom politically was akin to her siding with Tom against him, and he attached sexual connotations to it because of his own insecurities. When Alice called him old-fashioned, he seemed mostly to hear the bold, and he quickly defended his masculinity and sex appeal, which Alice, driven by her own anger, promptly ridiculed. This kind of argument is familiar among people living together. Both sides have feelings and concerns, but instead of discussing them openly, and identifying them correctly, the feelings are allowed to escalate into hostility, which only exacerbates the hurt and insecurity that initiated the discussion in the first place. It would be silly to proclaim that all anger, disagreement, hurt, and hostility between people who supposedly care about each other are functions of poor or inadequate communication. Often, people in close relationships have different needs, values, desires, and goals, about work, money, children, sex, household chores, which values to live by, and countless other issues. These natural differences produce stresses and tensions, which must either be lived with or resolved by compromise, yielding, or the dissolution of the relationship. But frequently the problem is miscommunication. How might Phil and Alice have communicated differently? Pretend for the moment that you are philosophy. And Alice, a person you love, approaches you and makes the following statement in a tone of voice that is non-blaming and non-judgmental. "Sweetheart, let me explain. I'm feeling insecure about my intelligence, or at least the way people view me on that, because I don't have all the degrees that you do. Since you are the most important person in my world, would be so gratified if you would acknowledge something I say that you think is smart and worthwhile. When we disagree on a substantive issue and you speak harshly or dismiss my points or become impatient with me, I feel insecure and disrespected. Earlier this evening, during our political discussion, would have felt so good if you had complimented me on some of my ideas and willingness to speak up. Imagine, now, that you are Alice, and Phil had opened the after-dinner discussion in the following way. Look, honey, this is difficult for me to talk about, but I'd like to try. I don't know what it is with me lately, but I was feeling some jealousy tonight. This isn't easy to say, but here goes. You and Tom seemed kind of close, both intellectually and physically, and I was feeling hurt and lonely. You may not realize this, but I've been slowing down, feeling tired, developing a paunch. I need some reassurance. Do you still find me good looking? I would love it if you'd look at me the way you seem to be looking at Tom this evening. My guess is that most people would be receptive and responsive to that kind of straight talk from a loved one. By straight talk, I mean a person's clear statement of his or her feelings and concerns without accusing, blaming, judging, or ridiculing the other person. Straight talk is effective precisely because it enables the recipient to listen non-defensively. Straight talk. A clear statement of a person's feelings and concerns without accusing, blaming, judging, or ridiculing the other person. Straight talk seems easy, and it is effective. Why don't people use it more often? Growing up in a competitive society, most of us have learned how to protect ourselves by making ourselves relatively invulnerable, those quills again. Thus, when we are hurt, we have learned not to show it. Rather, we have learned either to avoid the person who hurt us or to lash out at him or her with anger, judgment, or ridicule, which in turn, as Gottman observed, makes the other person defensive or produces a counterattack, and the argument escalates. Moreover, when we are busy criticizing, we often fail to give the other person the benefit of the doubt. As we have seen, a person's judgments about another person can take the form of dispositional attributions or to situational attributions. When you don't know why your best friend or life partner is behaving in a weird or unpleasant way or hasn't gotten back to you when they said they would, you have a choice. You can jump to a hostile, dispositional attribution. Or you can wait to find out why they are behaving that way and give them the benefit of the doubt with a situational attribution. Frank Fincham and Thomas Bradbury 100 studied 130 newly married couples over time and found that those couples who made dispositional attributions early in their marriages became increasingly unhappy with their spouses. In contrast, Couples who engaged in straight talk and made situational attributions became increasingly happy with their marriages. It is unwise to reveal your vulnerability to someone who is your sworn enemy and will use that knowledge against you. But it is almost certainly unwise to conceal your vulnerability from someone who is your loving friend and cares about you. If Alice and Phil had been aware of the other's insecurity, they each could have acted in ways that would have reassured the other. Because each of them had overlearned the societal lesson of attack rather than reveal, they inadvertently placed themselves on a collision course. Often, the problem is even more complicated than the one in this example. Alice and Phil know what their feelings are, and they got into serious conflict primarily because they had difficulty communicating them. But often, people are not fully aware of their own needs, wants, and feelings. Instead, they may have a vague feeling of discomfort or unhappiness that they can't easily pinpoint. Often they misattribute that vague feeling. At first, Phil blames Alice for her allegedly flirtatious behavior when he is really feeling insecure about his advancing middle age. Thus, if we are not in touch with our own feelings and cannot articulate them to ourselves, we cannot communicate them to anyone else. The key issue is sensitivity. Can we learn to be more sensitive to our own feelings? Can we learn to be sensitive to others so that, when people do make themselves vulnerable, we treat that vulnerability with care and respect? The importance of immediate feedback for communication. To be effective in a close relationship, we are able to give and receive immediate feedback on how our words and behaviors are interpreted. This gives us the information we need to gain insight into the impact of our actions and statements and to consider our options for meeting our own needs, as well as our partners. Suppose I do something that angers my best friend, who also happens to be my wife. If she doesn't express this anger, I may never become aware that what I did made her angry. Suppose she gives me immediate feedback. Suppose she tells me how my action makes her feel. Now I have at least two options. I can continue to behave in the same way, and continue to make her angry, or I can stop behaving that way. The choice is mine. What I've done may be so important to me that I don't want to give it up. Conversely, my wife's feelings may be so important to me that I choose to stop doing the thing that angers her. In the absence of any knowledge of how my behavior makes her feel, I don't have a choice. Moreover, knowing exactly how she feels about a particular action may allow me to explore a different way of satisfying my needs as well as hers. The value of immediate feedback is not limited to the recipient. Frequently, in providing feedback, people discover something about themselves. If Sharon believes, for example, that it's always destructive to express anger in any way, she may block out her awareness of this feeling. When she learns that it is legitimate for her to express that feeling, she has a chance to bring it out in the open, look at it, and become aware that her expression of anger has not caused the world to come to an end. Moreover, the direct expression of a feeling helps prevent its escalation that is harder to resolve. If my wife has learned to express her anger not by shouting or accusing but by stating her feelings and grievances directly, it keeps our discussion on the issue at hand. If she suppresses the anger but it leaks out in other ways, at different times and in different situations, or if she withdraws and seems sullen, I do not know where her hostility is coming from, and I become confused, hurt, or angry. Feelings versus judgments. People are often unaware of how to provide constructive feedback, instead doing it in a way that angers or upsets the recipient, thereby causing more problems than they solve. Let me offer an example of dysfunctional feedback and then show how people can learn to modify it to maximize communication and understanding. This example is an actual event that took place in a communication workshop I conducted for corporation executives. In the course of the workshop, one of the members looked squarely at another member and said, "Dave, I've been listening to you and watching you for a day and a half, and I want to give you some feedback. I think you're a phony." Now, that's quite an accusation. How can Dave respond? He has several options. He can agree with Mike, deny the accusation and say he's not a phony, express anger by retaliating, telling Mike what he thinks is wrong with him, or feel sorry for himself and go into a sulk. None of these responses is particularly productive. But doesn't Mike have the right to express this judgment? After all, he's only being open and honest. Don't we value openness and authenticity? This sounds like a dilemma. Effective communication requires openness, but openness can be hurtful to the recipient. The solution is to be open and, at the same time, to express yourself in a manner that causes a minimum of pain and maximizes the recipient's ability to understand your complaint. The key to effective communication rests on our willingness to express feelings rather than judgments. In this instance, Mike was not expressing a feeling, he was interpreting Dave's behavior and judging it. The word feeling has several meanings. In this context, I don't mean hunch or hypothesis, as when we say, I feel I'm right. By feeling I mean, specifically, anger or joy, sadness or happiness, annoyance, fear, discomfort, warmth, hurt, envy, jealousy, excitement, and the like. In the workshop, I began my intervention by asking Mike if he had any feelings about Dave. Mike thought for a moment and then said, "Well, I feel that Dave is a phony." Needless to say, this is not a feeling, as I just defined it, this is an opinion or a judgment expressed in the language of feelings. A judgment is nothing more or less than a feeling that is inadequately understood or inadequately expressed. Accordingly, I probed further by asking Mike what his feelings were. Mike still insisted that he felt Dave was a phony. "And what does that do to you?" I asked. "It annoys the hell out of me," answered Mike. "What kinds of things has Dave done that annoyed you?" I asked. "I'm annoyed by his phony way of charming people in the group," he replied. On further probing, it turned out that what really annoyed Mike was Dave's apparent attractiveness to women. Eventually Mike owned up to his real feeling of envy. He wished he had Dave's easy charm and popularity. Note that Mike had initially masked this feeling of envy. Instead, he had discharged his feelings by expressing disdain, by saying Dave was a phony. He was protecting his ego. Because we live in a competitive society, Mike had learned over the years that, if he had admitted to feeling envious, it might make him look vulnerable and weak. By expressing disdain and anger, however, Mike was trying to portray himself as strong and assertive. Although his behavior was successful as an ego-protecting device, it didn't contribute to Mike's understanding of his own feelings and of the events that caused them. It certainly didn't contribute to Mike's understanding of Dave or to Dave's understanding of Mike. As an ego-defensive measure, Mike's behavior was adaptive. As a form of communication, it was maladaptive. Although it made Mike vulnerable to admit the truth, that he envied Dave, that admission opened the door to better communication and mutual understanding. It's easier for all of us to hear feedback that is expressed in terms of feelings, "I'm upset," than feedback expressed as a judgment or accusation, "You are a thoughtless jerk." When Mike told Dave he was a phony, Mike was telling Dave what kind of person he is. Generally, people resent being told what kind of person they are, and for good reason, because such attributions are purely a matter of conjecture. Mike's dispositional attribution about Dave's behavior may reflect reality or, just as likely, it may not. It is merely Mike's theory about Dave. Only Dave knows for sure whether he's an insincere phony. Mike is only guessing. But Mike's statement that he is feeling envious or angry is not a guess or a theory, it is an absolute fact. Mike is not guessing about his own feelings, he knows them. Dave may or may not care about Mike's judgments, but if he wants to be Mike's friend, he might want to know Mike's feelings and what he did to trigger them. And now Dave has a choice. He can modify his behavior or he can keep doing what he does, while recognizing that his behavior might evoke envy, hostility, and competitiveness from other men. Mike and Dave were not lovers. They were merely two guys in a workshop, trying to improve their communication skills. When people learn to express their feelings without judging the other person as being wrong, insensitive, or uncaring, escalation rarely follows. Effective communication is useful for everyone, but especially crucial in maintaining our closest, most important connections, with family members, friends, and romantic partners. Social scientists and historians who have studied the past and future of marriage have identified aspects of modern relationships that are better than ever before, and also aspects that are worse than ever before. 101 In the past, marriages were less about love and more about business arrangements, uniting families, combining resources, or producing children to run the farm. Today's marriages of love are surely better in many ways. Gender roles have become more egalitarian and flexible, and the division of family labor is much less stereotyped. The Annie Oakleys of the world need not give up their talents and ambitions for love, and the Frank Butlers of the world need not cling to notions of male dominance and assert their rights over those of their partner. But modern marriages, precisely because they are based on love and equality and not a business arrangement, are also often freighted with a heavy load of expectations and responsibilities. We expect a life partner to provide companionship, sex, passion, help with child-rearing and chores, income, adventure, freedom, and self-expression. I'm persuaded that those who can peel away the unrealistic expectations of modern love, while keeping their eyes on the enduring benefits of intimacy and connection, can achieve lasting love and a better marriage or relationship than at any other time in human history. Perhaps the Beatles said it best in their song, The End. And in the end the love you take is equal to the love you make. 9. Social Psychology as a Science. Saul Steinberg, Untitled Drawing, Ink on Paper. Originally published in The New Yorker, September 10, 1960. When I was in college, I first got interested in social psychology because it dealt with some of the most exciting aspects of being human: love, hate, prejudice, aggression, altruism, social influence, conformity, and the like. At that time, I didn't care a great deal about how this impressive body of knowledge came into existence. I simply wanted to know what was known. It wasn't until I entered graduate school that it suddenly dawned on me that I could be more than a consumer of this knowledge, I could become a producer, as well. And a whole new world opened up for me, the world of scientific social psychology. I learned how to ask significant questions and do the experiments to find the answers to those questions, contributing, in my own small way, to the body of knowledge that I had read about as a student. And I have been passionately involved in that activity ever since. Reading this chapter is not going to make you into a scientist. My intention for you is a bit less ambitious but no less important. My aim is to help you improve your ability to think scientifically about things that are happening in your own social world. I have always found this a useful thing to be able to do, but occasionally it can be disillusioning as well. Several years ago, I picked up a copy of The New Yorker, in which I read an excellent, highly informative essay by James Cunin about college-level educational programs in our prisons. Cunin wrote enthusiastically about their effectiveness. He then went on to decry the fact that a generally punitive congressional majority was eliminating these programs after characterizing them as wasteful and coddling criminals. Cunin's essay contained a few vivid case histories of convicts who, while in prison, completed the college program and went on to lead productive lives after being released. The case histories were heartwarming. But, as a scientist, I wanted to know if there were any systematic data that I might use to evaluate the overall effectiveness of the program. Well, yes, Cunin reported one study by the New York State Department of Correctional Services, which found that 4 years after their release from prison, the recidivism rate of male inmates who had completed 1 or more years of higher education in prison was 20% lower than the average for all male inmates. That sounds pretty impressive, right? Let's take a closer look. As scientists, we need to ask one basic and vital question. Prior to participating in the program, were the prisoners who signed up for the program similar to those who didn't sign up? Might it be the case that the prisoners who signed up for the program and completed a year of it were different to begin with, say, in motivation, ability, intelligence? prior education, mental health, or what have you, from those who did not sign up. If they were different at the outset from the general run of prisoners, then it is likely that they would have had a lower rate of recidivism even without having taken the course of study. If that were the case, then it wasn't the program that caused the lower recidivism. While I was reading Cunan's article, the humanist in me wanted to get excited by the results of this study. It would be terrific to have convincing data proving that educating prisoners pays off. But, alas, the scientist in me took over and was skeptical. Thus, looking at the social world through the eyes of a scientist requires us to face our biases and preferences. But it also gives us the ability to separate the wheat from the chaff so that, as concerned citizens, we can demand that innovative programs be properly evaluated. In that way, we can determine, with some degree of clarity, which of thousands of possible programs are worthy of our time, effort, and money. And the truth is that, in most cases, it is not difficult to do the experiment properly, as you will see. What is the scientific method? The scientific method, regardless of whether it is being applied in physics, chemistry, biology, or social psychology, is the best way we humans have of satisfying our hunger for knowledge and understanding. We use the scientific method in an attempt to uncover lawful relationships among things, whether the things are chemicals, planets, or the antecedents of human prejudice or love. The first step in the scientific process is observation. In physics, a simple observation might go something like this. If there is a rubber ball in my granddaughter's wagon and she pulls the wagon forward, the ball seems to roll to the back of the wagon. When she stops the wagon abruptly, the ball rushes to the front of the wagon. In social psychology, a simple observation might go something like this. When I am waiting on tables, if I happen to be in a good mood and smile a lot at my customers, my tips seem to be a bit larger than when I am in a foul mood and smile less frequently. The next step is to make a guess as to why that happens. This guess is our taking a stab at uncovering the lawful relationship I mentioned. The third step is to frame that guess as a testable hypothesis. The final step is to design an experiment that will either confirm or disconfirm the hypothesis. If a series of well-designed, well-executed experiments fails to confirm that hypothesis, we give it up. As my favorite physicist, Richard Feynman, once put it, it doesn't matter how beautiful the guess is or how smart the guesser is, or how famous the guesser is, if the experiment disagrees with the guess, then the guess is wrong. That's all there is to it. In my own opinion, this is both the essence of science and its beauty. There are no sacred truths in science. Science and art, in my opinion, there is plenty of room for art in our science. I believe that the two processes, art and science, are different but related. Pavel Semenov, a distinguished Russian psychologist, did a pretty good job of defining the difference. As scientists, we look closely at our environment and try to organize the unknown in a sensible and meaningful way. As artists, we reorganize the known environment to create something entirely new. To this observation, I would add that the requirements of a good experiment frequently require skills from both of these domains. In a very real sense, as experimenters, we use artistry to enrich our science. I believe this to be particularly true of experiments in social psychology. Why is this blending of art and science especially true of social psychology? In social psychology, we are not studying the behavior of chemicals in a beaker or of rubber balls in wagons. We are investigating the behavior of adults who have been living in a social world for their entire lives, with all the emotions, perceptions, beliefs, biases, and experiences they bring to that world. It goes without saying that, like the experimenters who are studying them, the people who serve as participants in our experiments have developed their own ideas and theories about what causes their feelings and behavior, as well as the feelings and behavior of the people around them. This is not the case when you are performing experiments with chemicals, with laboratory animals, or even with humans in non-social situations. The fact that we are dealing with socially sophisticated human beings is part of what makes social psychology so fascinating as a topic of experimental investigation. At the same time, this situation also demands a great deal of art if the experimenter stands a chance of generating valid and reliable findings. In this chapter, I will try to communicate exactly how this happens. From speculation to experimentation. In Chapter 8, I told the story of President John F. Kennedy, whose popularity increased immediately after he committed a stupendously costly blunder. After his tragic miscalculation known as the Bay of Pigs fiasco, a Gallup poll showed that people liked him better than they had prior to that incident. Like most people, I was dumbfounded by this event. How could we like a guy better after he screwed up so badly? As a scientist, I speculated about what could have caused that shift. My guess was that, because Kennedy previously had been perceived as a nearly perfect man, handsome, warm, charming, witty, competent, committing a blunder might have made him seem more human, thus allowing ordinary people to feel closer to him. An interesting speculation, but was it true? How might we have tried to find out? Well, we might have simply asked people why they liked Kennedy more now than they did the prior week. That sounds simple enough. Unfortunately, it is not that easy, because social psychologists have learned that people are often unaware of why they act in certain ways or change their beliefs in one direction or another, so, in a complex situation, simply asking people to explain their behavior will usually not yield reliable results. This is precisely why social psychologists perform experiments. But how could we conduct an experiment on John F. Kennedy's popularity? We couldn't. In a case like this, we would try to conduct an experiment on the underlying phenomenon, not on the specific example of it. And, indeed, it was really the underlying phenomenon, not the specific event, that interested me. Does committing a blunder increase the popularity of a nearly perfect person? My colleagues and I thus designed an experiment that allowed us to control for extraneous variables and test the effects of a blunder on attraction in a less complex situation, one in which we could control the exact nature of the blunder, as well as the kind of person who committed it. And in that simple situation we found, as predicted, that, nearly perfect, people become more attractive after they commit a blunder, while rather ordinary people become less attractive after committing the identical blunder. As you see, in striving for control, the experimenter must bring his or her ideas out of the helter-skelter of the real world and into the rather sterile confines of the laboratory. This typically entails concocting a situation bearing little resemblance to the real-world situation that originally generated the idea. In fact, a frequent criticism is that laboratory experiments are unrealistic, contrived imitations of human interaction that don't reflect the real world at all. How accurate is this criticism? Perhaps the best way to answer this question is to examine one laboratory experiment in detail, considering its advantages and disadvantages, as well as an alternative, more realistic approach that might have been used to study the same issue. The initiation experiment I did in collaboration with Judson Mills suits this purpose admirably, because it contains many of the advantages and disadvantages of the laboratory. You may recall that Mills and I hypothesized that people might come to like things more if they have suffered to get them. We then designed and conducted a laboratory experiment in which we showed that people who expended great effort to gain membership in a group liked the group more than did people who became members with little or no effort. Here's how we constructed the experiment. The Aronson-Mills experiment up close 63 college women who initially volunteered to engage in several discussions on the psychology of sex participated in the study. Each student was tested individually. At the beginning, I explained that I was studying the dynamics of the group discussion process. I said the actual topic of the discussion did not matter to me, but because most people are interested in sex, I selected that topic to be certain of having plenty of participants. I also explained that I had encountered a major drawback in choosing sex as the topic. Many people were shy and found it difficult to discuss sex in a group setting. Because any impediment to the flow of the discussion could seriously invalidate the results, I needed to know if the women felt any hesitancy to enter a discussion about sex. When they heard this, each one said she would have no difficulty. These elaborate instructions set the stage for the event to follow. Up to this point, the instructions had been the same for all participants. Now it was time to give each of the women in the various experimental conditions a different experience, an experience that we experimenters believed would make a difference. We randomly assigned the participants in advance to one of three conditions. 1/3 of them would go through a severe initiation, 1/3 would go through a mild initiation, and 1/3 would not go through any initiation at all. For the no initiation condition, I simply told participants they could now join the discussion group. For the severe and mild initiation conditions, however, I told each participant that, because it was necessary to be positive she could discuss sex openly, I had developed a screening device. A test for embarrassment, that I then asked her to take. This test constituted the initiation. For the severe initiation condition, the test was highly embarrassing. It required the woman to recite a list of 12 obscene words and 2 detailed descriptions of sexual activity taken from contemporary novels. The mild initiation participants had to recite only a list of words related to sex that were not obscene. The 3 conditions to which participants were assigned constituted the independent variable in this study. Every investigator's goal in designing and conducting an experiment is to determine if what happens to participants has an effect on how they respond. Our goal was to determine if severity of initiation, the independent variable, caused systematic differences in participants' behavior. Would participants who experienced a severe initiation act differently from those who experienced a mild initiation or no initiation at all? Independent variable. The variable an experimenter changes or varies to see if it has an effect on some other variable. But act differently in what way? After the initiation, each participant was allowed to eavesdrop on a discussion being conducted by members of the group she had just joined. To control the content of this material, we used a tape recording but told the women they were hearing a live discussion. In that way we made sure that all participants, regardless of whether they had gone through a severe initiation, a mild initiation, or no initiation, heard the same group discussion. The group discussion was as incredibly dull and boring as we could make it. The people on the tape spoke with long pauses, a great deal of hemming and hawing, interruptions, and incomplete sentences as they discussed, inarticulately, the secondary sex characteristics of lower animals, changes in plumage among birds, intricacies of the mating dance of certain spiders, etc. At the end of the discussion, I returned with a set of rating scales and asked each woman to rate how interesting and worthwhile the discussion had been. This response is called the dependent variable because, quite literally, the response is assumed to be dependent on the particular experimental conditions the participant had been assigned to. The dependent variable is what the experimenter measures to assess the effects of the independent variable. In short, if the independent variable is the cause, then the dependent variable is the effect. Dependent variable. A response assumed to be dependent on a particular experimental condition. The result supported our hypothesis. Women who went through a mild initiation or no initiation at all saw the group discussion for what it was and rated it as being dull. But those who suffered embarrassment in order to be admitted to the group thought it was really exciting. Remember, all the students were rating exactly the same discussion. Why do an experiment? Designing and conducting this experiment was a laborious process. Mills and I spent hundreds of hours planning it, creating a credible situation, writing a script for the tape recording of the group discussion, rehearsing the actors who played the roles of group members, constructing the initiation procedures and the measuring instruments, recruiting volunteers to serve as participants. Pilot testing the procedure, running the participants through the experiment, and explaining the true purpose of the experiment to each participant. What we found was that people who go through a severe initiation to join a group liked that group a great deal more than people who go through a mild initiation or no initiation at all. Surely there must be a simpler way. There is. You may have noticed a resemblance between our experimental procedure and other initiations, such as those used by some college fraternities and other exclusive clubs or organizations. Why, then, didn't we take advantage of a real-life situation, which is not only easier to study but also far more dramatic and realistic? Let's look at the advantages. Real-life initiations would be more severe. We would not have had to go to such lengths to design a group setting that participants would find convincing. The social interactions would involve real people rather than mere voices on a tape recording. We would have eliminated the ethical problem created by the use of deception and the use of a difficult and unpleasant experience in the name of science, and, finally, it could all have been accomplished in a fraction of the time the experiment consumed. Thus, when we take a superficial look at the advantages of a natural situation, it appears that Mills and I would have had a much simpler job if we had studied existing fraternities. Here is how we might have done it. We could have rated each fraternity's initiation procedures for their degree of severity and interviewed the members later. If the members who had undergone a severe initiation liked their fraternities more than the mild or no initiation fraternity members, the hypothesis would be supported. Or would it? Let's take a closer look at why people bother to do experiments. When I asked my students to name the most important characteristic of a laboratory experiment, the great majority said, control. Experiments have the advantage of controlling the environment and the variables so that the effects of each variable can be precisely studied. By taking our hypothesis to the laboratory, Mills and I eliminated a lot of the extraneous variation that exists in the real world. The severe initiations were all equal in intensity. This condition would have been difficult to match if we had used several severe initiation fraternities. Further, the group discussion was identical for all participants. In the real world, however, fraternity members would have been rating fraternities that were, in fact, different from one another. Assuming we had found a difference between the severe initiation and mild initiation fraternities in how much their new members liked being in them, how would we have known whether this was a function of the initiation rather than of differences in likability that already existed in the fraternity members themselves? In the experiment, the only difference was the severity of the initiation, so we know that any difference was because of that procedure. The importance of random assignment. Control is a central aspect of the laboratory experiment, but it is not the major advantage. An even more critical advantage is that participants can be randomly assigned to the different experimental conditions. This means each participant has an equal chance to be in any condition in the study. Indeed, the random assignment of participants to conditions is the crucial difference between the experimental method and non-experimental approaches. And the great advantage of the random assignment of people to conditions is this: any variables not thoroughly controlled are, in theory, distributed randomly across the conditions. This means it is extremely unlikely that such variables would affect results in a systematic fashion. An example might help to clarify this point. Suppose you are a scientist and you have the hypothesis that men who marry intelligent women become happier than men who marry not so intelligent women. How do you test this hypothesis? Let us say you proceed to find 1,000 men who are married to intelligent women and 1,000 men who are married to not so intelligent women, and you give them all a happiness questionnaire. Lo and behold, you find that the men married to intelligent women are happier than the men married to less intelligent women. Does this mean that being married to an intelligent woman makes a man happy? No. Perhaps happy men are sweeter, more good-humored, and easier to get along with, and, consequently, intelligent women seek out these men and marry them. So it may be that being happy causes men to marry intelligent women. The problem doesn't end there. It is also possible that there is some third factor that causes both happiness and being married to an intelligent woman. One such factor could be money. Perhaps being rich helps make men happy and being rich is what attracts the intelligent women. So it is possible that neither causal sequence is true. Happiness does not cause men to marry intelligent women and intelligent women do not cause men to be happy. The problem is even more complicated because we usually have no idea what these third factors might be. In the case of the happiness study, it could be wealth. It could also be that a mature personality causes men to be happy and also attracts intelligent women. It could be social grace, athletic ability, power, popularity, using the right toothpaste, being a cool dresser, or any of 1,000 qualities the poor researcher does not know about and could not possibly account for. But if the researcher performs an experiment, he or she can randomly assign participants to various experimental conditions. Although this procedure does not eliminate differences because of any of these variables, it neutralizes them by distributing these characteristics randomly across experimental conditions. If participants are randomly assigned, there will be approximately as many rich men in one experimental condition as in the others, as many socially adept men in one condition as in the others, and as many athletes in one condition as in the others. Thus, if we do find a difference between conditions, it is unlikely that this would be because of individual differences in any single characteristic because all of these characteristics had an equal distribution across all of the conditions. Admittedly, the particular example of intelligent women and their happy husbands does not easily lend itself to the confines of the experimental laboratory. But let us fantasize about how we would do it if we could. Ideally, we would take 50 men and randomly assign 25 of them to marry intelligent women and 25 to marry less intelligent women. A few months later, we could come back and administer the happiness questionnaire. If the men assigned to the intelligent wives are happier than the men assigned to the less intelligent wives, we would know what caused their happiness. We did. In short, their happiness couldn't easily be attributed to social grace, handsomeness, money, or power. These were randomly distributed among the experimental conditions. It almost certainly was caused by their wives' characteristics. This example is pure fantasy. Even social psychologists must stop short of arranging marriages for scientific purposes. But this does not mean we cannot test meaningful, relevant events under controlled laboratory conditions. This book has been loaded with such examples. Let's look at one of them as a way of clarifying the advantages of the experimental method, the correlation between the amount of time children spend watching violence on television and their tendency to choose aggressive solutions to their problems. Does this mean watching aggression on television causes youngsters to become aggressive? Not necessarily, but it might. It might also mean that aggressive children simply like to watch aggression, and they would be just as aggressive if they watched Sesame Street all day long. But then, as we saw, some experimenters came along and proved that watching violence increases violence. How? The experimenters randomly assigned some children to a situation in which they watched a video of an episode of a violent TV series, an episode in which people beat, slug, bite, and kill each other for 25 minutes. As a control, the experimenters randomly assigned other children to a situation in which they watched an athletic event for the same length of time. The crucial point: each child stood an equal chance of being selected to watch the violent video as the non-violent video. Therefore, any differences in personality dispositions among the children were neutralized across the two experimental conditions. Thus, the finding that youngsters who watched the violent video became more aggressive afterward than those who watched the athletic event suggests quite strongly that watching violence can lead to violence. You may recall that this was precisely the problem with the evaluation of the prison college program that I described at the beginning of this chapter. The prisoners who volunteered for the program were probably different in many ways from those who did not volunteer, so it was misleading to compare their recidivism rate with that of the non-volunteers. Such a comparison would stack the deck, making the program appear more effective than it actually was. How do you solve that problem? One way would be to attract twice as many volunteers for the program as you can handle. Then you can randomly select half of the volunteers for the program and place the other half in the control condition. If the selection is truly random, comparing the recidivism rate of the two groups would give you meaningful data. Let us return to the initiation experiment. If we conducted a survey and found that members of severe initiation fraternities like one another more than do members of mild initiation fraternities, then we would have evidence that severity of initiation and liking for other members are positively correlated. This means that the more severe the initiation, the more a member will like his fraternity brothers. No matter how highly correlated the two variables are, however, we cannot conclude, from our survey data alone, that severe initiations cause liking for the group. All we can conclude from such a survey is that these two factors are associated with each other. It is possible that the positive correlation between severe initiation and liking for other members of a fraternity exists not because severe initiations cause members to like their groups more, but for just the opposite reason. It could be that the high personal appeal of the group causes severe initiations. If group members see themselves as the cream of the crop, they may try to keep the situation that way by maintaining an elite group. And they might try to maintain an elite group by requiring a severe initiation to discourage less motivated people from joining. From our survey data alone, we cannot conclude that this explanation is false and that severe initiations really do lead to liking. The data give us no basis for making this choice, because they tell us nothing about cause and effect. Moreover, as we have seen, a third variable could be causing both severe initiations and liking. Who would like to give and receive a severe initiation? Why, people with strong sadomasochistic tendencies, of course. Such people may like one another not because of the initiation but because birds of a feather tend to like one another. Although this may sound like an outlandish explanation, it is certainly possible. What is more distressing for the researcher are the countless other explanations he or she can't even think of. The experimental method, based as it is on the technique of random assignment to experimental conditions, eliminates all of these in one fell swoop. Sadomasochists in this experiment have just as much chance of being assigned to the no-initiation condition as to the severe initiation condition. In a real-world study, almost all of them would assign themselves to the severe initiation condition, thus making the results uninterpretable. The challenge of experimentation in social psychology. All is not sunny in the world of experimentation. There are some serious problems connected with doing experiments. Control is one of the major advantages of the experiment, yet it is impossible to exercise complete control over the environment of human participants. One of the reasons many psychologists work with rats rather than people is that researchers are able to control almost everything that happens to their participants from the time of their birth until the experiment ends: climate, diet, exercise, degree of exposure to playmates, absence of traumatic experiences, and so on. Social psychologists do not keep human participants in cages to control their experiences. Although this makes for a happier world for the participants, it also makes for a slightly sloppy science. Control versus impact control is further limited by the fact that individuals differ from one another in countless subtle ways. Social psychologists try to make statements about what people do. By this we mean, of course, what most people do most of the time under a given set of conditions. To the extent that unmeasured individual differences are present in our results, our conclusions may not be precise for all people. Differences in attitudes, values, abilities, personality characteristics, and recent experiences can affect the way people respond in an experiment. Thus, even with our ability to control the experimental situation itself, the same situation may not affect each person in exactly the same way. Furthermore, when we do succeed in controlling the experimental setting so that it is exactly the same for every person, we run the risk of making the situation so sterile that the participant is inclined not to take it seriously. The word sterile has at least two meanings: germ-free and ineffective or barren. The experimenter should strive to make the experimental situation as germ-free as possible, without making it barren or unlifelike for the participant. If participants do not find the events of an experiment interesting and absorbing, chances are their reactions will not be spontaneous, and our results, therefore, will have little meaning. Thus, in addition to control, an experiment must have an impact on the participants. They must take the experiment seriously and become involved in it, lest it not affect their behavior in a meaningful way. The difficulty for social psychologists is that these two crucial factors, impact and control, often work in opposite ways. As one increases, the other tends to decrease. The dilemma facing experimenters is how to maximize the impact on the participants without sacrificing control over the situation. Resolving this dilemma requires considerable creativity and ingenuity in the design and construction of experimental situations. This leads us to the problem of realism. Realism. Early in this chapter, I mentioned that a frequent criticism of laboratory experiments is that they are artificial and contrived imitations of the world, that they aren't real. What do we mean by real? Several years ago, in writing about the experimental method, Merrill Carl Smith and I tried to pinpoint the definition of real. We reasoned that an experiment can be realistic in two separate ways. First, if an experiment has an impact on the participants, forces them to take the matter seriously, and involves them in the procedures, we can say it has achieved experimental realism. Second, if the laboratory experiment is similar to the events that frequently happen to people in the outside world, we can say it has achieved mundane realism. Often, confusion between experimental realism and mundane realism is responsible for the criticism that experiments are artificial and worthless because they don't reflect the real world. The difference between the two realisms can best be illustrated by an example of a study high in experimental realism but low in mundane realism. Recall the experiment by Stanley Milgram, discussed in Chapter 4, in which each participant was asked to deliver shocks of increasing intensity to another person who was supposedly wired to an electrical apparatus in an adjoining room. Now, honestly, how many times in everyday life are we asked to deliver electric shocks to people? The setup was unrealistic, but only in the mundane sense. Did the procedure have experimental realism, that is, were the participants wrapped up in it, did they take it seriously, did it have an impact on them, was it part of their real world at that moment? Or were they merely play-acting, not taking it seriously, going through the motions? Ho-humming it? Milgram reports that his participants experienced a great deal of tension and discomfort. But I'll let Milgram describe, in his own words, what a typical participant looked like. I observed a mature and initially poised businessman enter the laboratory smiling and confident. Within 20 minutes he was reduced to a twitching, stuttering wreck, who was rapidly approaching a point of nervous collapse. He constantly pulled on his earlobe, and twisted his hands. At one point he pushed his fist onto his forehead and muttered, "Oh God, let's stop it." And yet he continued to respond to every word of the experimenter, and obeyed to the end. This hardly seems like the behavior of a person in an unrealistic situation. The things happening to Milgram's participants were real, even though they didn't happen to them in their everyday experience. Accordingly, it would seem safe to conclude that the results of this experiment are a reasonably accurate indication of the way people would react if a similar set of events did occur in the real world. Deception. The importance of experimental realism cannot be overemphasized. The best way to achieve this essential quality is to design a setting that will be absorbing and interesting to the participants. At the same time, it is frequently necessary to disguise the true purpose of the study. Why the need for disguise? At the beginning of this book, I noted that just about everybody is an amateur social psychologist, in the sense that we all live in a social world and are constantly forming hypotheses about things that are happening to us. That is just as true for the individuals who serve as participants in our experiments. Because they are always trying to figure things out, if they knew what we were trying to get at, they might be apt to behave in a manner consistent with their own hypotheses, instead of behaving in a way that is natural and usual for them. For this reason, experimenters try to conceal the true nature of the experiment from the participants. Because we are almost always dealing with intelligent adults, this is not an easy task, but it is an absolute requirement in most experiments if we are to stand a chance of obtaining valid and reliable data. This requirement puts the social psychologist in the position of a film director who is setting the stage for action but not telling the actor what the play is all about. Such settings are called cover stories and are designed to increase experimental realism by producing a situation in which the participant can act naturally, without being inhibited by knowing just which aspect of behavior is being studied. For example, in the Aronson-Mills initiation study, we told participants that they were taking a test for embarrassment to screen them for membership in a group that would be discussing the psychology of sex. This was the cover story. It was pure deception. In reality, we were subjecting them to an initiation to see what effect, if any, this would have on their liking for the group. If the participants had been aware of the true purpose of the study before their participation, the results would have been totally meaningless. In fact, researchers who have studied this issue have shown that if participants know the true purpose of an experiment, they do not behave naturally but either try to perform in a way that puts themselves in a good light or try to help out the experimenter by behaving in a way that would make the experiment come out as the participants think it should. Both of these outcomes are disastrous for the experimenter. The experimenter can usually succeed in curbing the participant's desire to be helpful, but it is harder to curb the participant's desire to look good. Most people do not want to be thought of as obedient, weak, abnormal, conformist, unattractive, stupid, or crazy. Thus, if given a chance to figure out what the experimenter is looking for, most people will try to make themselves look good or what they think is normal. For example, in an experiment designed specifically to examine this phenomenon, when my colleagues and I told participants that a particular outcome indicated they possessed a good personality trait, they did what they could to produce that outcome far more often than when we told them it reflected a negative trait. Although this behavior is understandable, it does interfere with meaningful results. For this reason, experimenters find it necessary to deceive participants about the true nature of the experiment. To illustrate, let's look again at Solomon Asch's 11 classic experiment on conformity. Recall that, in this study, a student was assigned the simple task of judging the relative size of a few lines. But a few other students, who were accomplices of the experimenter, purposely stated an incorrect judgment. In this situation, a sizable number of the participants yielded to the implicit group pressure and stated an incorrect judgment. The participants were deceived. They thought they were in an experiment on perception, but they were actually in a study of conformity. Was this deception necessary? I think so. Let's play it back without the deception. Imagine you enter this study and the experimenter says to you, "I am interested in studying whether or not you will conform in the face of group pressure," and then he tells you what is going to happen. My guess is that you wouldn't conform. My guess is that almost no one would conform, because conformity is considered a weak and unattractive act. What could the experimenter have concluded? That people tend to be nonconformists? Such a conclusion would be erroneous and misleading. Such an experiment would be meaningless. In Milgram's experiments on obedience, around 65% of the average citizens were willing to administer intense shocks to another person in obedience to the experimenter's command. Yet, each year, when I described the experimental situation to the students in my class and asked them if they would obey such a command, only 1% indicate that they would. Does this mean my students are nicer people than Milgram's participants? I don't think so. I think it means that people, if given half a chance, will try to look good. Thus, unless Milgram used deception, he would have come out with results that simply do not reflect the way people behave when they are led to believe they are in real situations. If we were to give people the opportunity to sit back, relax, and make a guess as to how they would behave in a certain situation, we would get a picture of how people would like to be rather than a picture of how people are. Replication problems. Scientific inquiry does not end when an experiment does. Rarely does a single experiment, even one that is perfectly constructed and yields beautiful, clear results, give us final answers. The next step in the process of science is replication, in which the original study is repeated by other investigators in other labs. Replication helps clarify the research, establishing the conditions under which it applies and those under which it doesn't apply, as well as for whom it is most applicable, e.g., does it work only for young adults, Americans, and college students, or for older people, Europeans, and blue-collar workers as well? Replication also can determine whether the phenomenon is robust and lasting or something of a fluke. If scientists are unable to duplicate the original results, one of two things must be true: they didn't do the replications accurately or appropriately, or the original investigators' conclusions were limited or wrong. Earlier in this chapter 1 said that doing a good experiment is a matter of both art and science. When I worked with my colleagues doing dissonance experiments, for instance, I spent a lot of time getting things just right, working, as I said, as much like a film director as a scientific investigator. The science part is easier to replicate than the art part. After all, I can eat a magnificent soufflé in a restaurant and be so impressed by the chef's creation that I immediately buy his cookbook on how to create the perfect soufflé. I can use his recipe to try to replicate that creation, but I guarantee that mine will look more like a brick than his light and fluffy concoction. Theories and procedures are like recipes. Sometimes a failed replication is a failure of the technique, a misreading of the recipe, not a failure of the hypothesis. Sometimes a replication catches a mistake in the original experimenter's procedures, analysis of data, or even their unintentional biases. One well-done, indeed irresistible study conducted in the 1970s showed that newborn infants imitate the facial expressions of adults. For example, the experimenter would stick out his tongue, and the baby would do the same, suggesting that babies are born with the ability to imitate. But a much better controlled experiment conducted recently has found that this skill at imitation is learned, beginning at about 6 months of age. 12. Finally, sometimes a replication fails, but in so doing reveals a previously unknown, missing ingredient that was crucial to the original research but that was absent in the second. Consider a study in which minority students who wrote essays describing an important personal value later received higher grades than students in a control group who wrote essays about other people's values. 13. This was a dramatic finding, so there were many attempts to replicate, but only some of them worked. Does this mean that the original study was false? Not at all. It turns out that this intervention does not work in every school. It replicates only when it is used in schools where the minority students feel a great deal of prejudice against them. 14. Nevertheless, a new problem across all the sciences has emerged, enabled by social media. A number of hot findings now get instant attention, and then often cool off when other researchers try to replicate them. Here are a few examples of studies that went viral but failed to be supported by other experimenters. Reading a list of age-related words triggers images of old people and makes young people walk more slowly. Washing your hands makes you feel less guilty. Working in a room with a large poster of a man's eyes staring at you makes you more honest. Sniffing the cuddle hormone, oxytocin, makes you more empathic, and holding a warm cup of coffee makes you feel more loved. One of the most popular was the alleged power pose. Putting your hands on your hips and widening your stance would make people feel bolder and more confident and even increase their testosterone levels. Before long, one of the study's researchers had written a best-selling book and given a TED Talk that became one of the most viewed in TED history. Your body language shapes who you are. Unfortunately, most of the many replications of this research failed to produce significant results, especially regarding the testosterone claims and the persistence of the effect. Joseph Simmons and Yuri Simonson 15 conducted a statistical analysis on 33 of the subsequently published studies, which used much larger samples than the originals, and concluded that the existing evidence is too weak to advocate for people to engage in power posing to better their lives. Today, unfortunately, there have been many pop social psychology findings that get public attention and then don't pass the test of replication. 16. But that does not mean that the basic methods of social psychological experimentation are at fault. It means that science is moving along as it should, correcting its mistakes and advancing the findings that hold up. It also means, however, that the public should be wary of sensational, improbable, or simplistic findings and ask, but have they been replicated? Ethical problems. Using deception may be the best way to get useful information about the way people behave in complicated situations, but it does present the experimenter with 3 ethical problems. 1. It is simply unethical to lie to people. In today's world of fake news and the blatant lies of politicians, can social scientists justify adding to the pollution of deception that currently exists? 2. Deception frequently leads to an invasion of privacy. When participants do not know what the experimenter is really studying, they are in no position to give their informed consent. For example, in Ash's experiment, some students might not have agreed to participate had they known in advance that Ash was interested in examining their tendency toward conformity rather than their perceptual judgment. 3. Experimental procedures often entail some unpleasant experiences, such as pain, boredom, anxiety, or embarrassment. Ethical problems arise even when deception is not used and when experimental procedures are not extreme. Sometimes even the most seemingly benign procedure can profoundly affect a few participants in ways that could not easily have been anticipated, even by the most sensitive and caring experimenters. Consider a series of experiments on social dilemmas, conducted by Robin Dawes, Jean McTavish, and Harriet Shackley. 17 Typically, participants are faced with the decision to cooperate with a partner or to defect. If everyone cooperates, everyone benefits financially, but if one or more participants choose to defect, they receive a high payoff, and those who choose to cooperate are at a financial disadvantage. Responses are anonymous and remain so throughout the course of the study. The rules of the game are fully explained to all participants at the beginning of the experiment. And no deception is involved. This scenario seems innocuous enough. But 24 hours after one experimental session, a man telephoned the experimenter. He had been the only defector in his group and had won $190. He wanted to return his winnings and have them divided among the other participants. He felt miserable about his greedy behavior, he said, and hadn't slept all night. After a similar experiment, a woman who had cooperated while others defected reported that she felt gullible and had learned that people were not as trustworthy as she had earlier believed. Despite careful planning by the investigators, therefore, these experiments had a powerful impact on participants that could not have been easily anticipated. My point is simple, but important. No code of ethics can anticipate all problems, especially those created when participants discover something unpleasant about themselves or others in the course of their participation. Social psychologists who conduct experiments are deeply concerned about ethical issues, precisely because their work is constructed on an ethical dilemma. Let me explain. This dilemma is based on 2 conflicting values to which most social psychologists subscribe. On the one hand, they believe in the value of free scientific inquiry. On the other hand, they believe in the dignity of humans and their right to privacy. This dilemma is a real one and cannot be dismissed either by piously defending the importance of preserving human dignity or by glibly pledging allegiance to the cause of science. And social psychologists must face this problem squarely, not just once but every time they design and conduct an experiment, for there is no concrete and universal set of rules or guidelines capable of governing every experiment. Obviously, some experimental techniques present more problems than others. In general, experiments that employ deception are cause for concern because the act of lying is, in itself, objectionable, even if the deception is at the service of uncovering the truth. And procedures that cause pain, embarrassment, guilt, or other intense feelings present obvious ethical problems. A more subtle ethical problem results when participants confront some aspect of themselves that is not pleasant or positive, as some of the people in the experiments by Dawes, McTavish, and Shackley did. And many of Solomon Ash's participants learned that they would conform in the face of group pressure. Many participants in our own experiment learned that they were capable of cheating at a game of cards. Most of Milgram's participants learned that they would obey an authority even if such obedience involved harming another person. It could be argued that such self-discovery is of therapeutic or educational benefit to participants. Indeed, many participants themselves have made this point. But this does not, in itself, justify these procedures. After all, how could an experimenter know in advance that it would be therapeutic? Moreover, it would be arrogant of any scientist to decide that he or she has the right or the skill to provide people with a therapeutic experience without their prior permission to do so. Given these problems, do the ends of social psychological research justify the means? This is a debatable point. Some argue that, no matter what the goals of this science are and no matter what the accomplishments, they are not worth it if people are deceived or put through some discomfort. On the opposite end of the spectrum, others insist that social psychologists are finding things out that may have profound benefits for humankind, and accordingly, almost any price is worth paying for the results. My own position is somewhere in between. I believe the science of social psychology is valuable, and I also believe that the health and welfare of experimental participants should be protected at all times. When deciding whether a particular experimental procedure is ethical, I believe a cost-benefit analysis is appropriate. That is, we should consider how much good will derive from doing the experiment and how much harm will be done to the experimental participants. Put another way, the benefits to science and society are compared with the costs to the participants, and this ratio is entered into the decision calculus. Unfortunately, such a comparison is difficult to make because we can never be absolutely certain of either the benefit or the harm in advance of the experiment. Consider the obedience experiment. On the face of it, it was a difficult procedure, all right. No doubt about it. But Milgram had no way of knowing exactly how difficult it was until he was deeply into the experiment. In my opinion, it was also an extremely illuminating experiment, one that taught us a great deal about human behavior. In the balance, I'm glad that Milgram went ahead with it. However, I know that not everyone will agree with me. Immediately after its publication, the experiment was lambasted on ethical grounds, both by the popular press and by serious scientists. A few years after having published his results, Stanley Milgram confided in me, sadly, and with a tinge of bitterness, that he believed much of the criticism was fueled by the results he obtained rather than by the actual procedure he employed. That, in and of itself, evokes an interesting question. Would the criticisms of the ethics of Milgram's procedure have been less vehement if none of the participants had administered shocks beyond a moderate level of intensity? More than a decade later, Leonard Bickman and Matthew Zarantinello 19 discovered that Milgram's ruminations were on target. They did a simple little experiment in which they asked 100 people to read the procedure section of Milgram's experiment. Those who were informed that a high proportion of Milgram's participants had been fully obedient rated the procedure as more harmful than those who were informed that hardly anyone had been fully obedient. On a more general note, I would suggest that the ethics of any experiment would seem less problematic when the results tell us something pleasant or flattering about human nature than when they tell us something we'd rather not know. That certainly doesn't mean that we should limit our research to the discovery of flattering things. Milgram's obedience experiment is an excellent case in point. I believe that, if a scientist is interested in studying the extent to which a person will harm others in blind obedience to authority, there is no way of doing it without producing some degree of discomfort. In sum, a social psychologist's decision whether or not to do a particular experiment depends on an assessment of its potential costs and benefits. I've always advised my students to follow these 5 guidelines. 1. Procedures that cause intense pain or intense discomfort should be avoided, if at all possible. Depending on the hypothesis being tested, some discomfort may be unavoidable. 2. Experimenters should provide their participants with the real option of quitting the experiment if their discomfort becomes too intense. 3. experimenters should be alert to alternative procedures to deception. If some other viable procedure can be found, it should be used. 4. Experimenters should spend considerable time with each participant at the close of the experimental session, carefully explaining the details of the experiment, its true purpose, and the reasons for the deception or discomfort. During this debriefing session, they should go out of their way to protect the dignity of participants, to avoid making them feel stupid or gullible about having fallen for the deception. They should make certain that participants leave the scene in good spirits, feeling good about themselves and their role in the experiment. This can be accomplished by any earnest experimenter who is willing to put in the time and effort to repay each participant for the vital role that he or she has played in the scientific enterprise. 5. Finally, experimenters should not undertake an experiment that relies on deception or creating discomfort, just for the hell of it. Before entering the laboratory, experimenters should be certain their experiment is sound and worthwhile, that they are seeking the answer to an interesting question and doing so in a careful, well-organized manner. Debriefing. The procedure whereby the purpose of the study and exactly what transpired is explained to participants at the end of an experiment. Experimenters in social psychology try hard to be as sensitive as possible to the needs of their participants. Although many experiments involve procedures that cause some degree of discomfort, the vast majority of these procedures contain many safeguards for the protection of participants. Again, let us return to the obedience experiment simply because, from the perspective of the participants, it is among the most stressful procedures reported in this book. Milgram worked hard after the experiment to turn the overall experience into a useful and exciting one for his participants, and his efforts paid off. Several weeks after the experiment, 84% of the participants reported that they were glad to have taken part in the study, 15% reported neutral feelings, and only 1% stated that they were sorry they had participated. We should view these findings with caution, however. The discussion of cognitive dissonance in Chapter 3 has taught us that people sometimes justify their behavior by changing their previously held attitudes. More convincing evidence comes from a follow-up study. 1 year after the experimental program was completed, a university psychiatrist interviewed a random sample of the participants and found no evidence of injurious effects. Rather, the typical response was that their participation was instructive and enriching. 20. Our debt to participants. I have been discussing the advantages of the experimental method and have shown how complex and challenging it is to design a laboratory experiment in social psychology. I have shared some of the excitement I feel in overcoming difficulties and discussed ways of ensuring the well-being, as well as the learning, of the participants in our experiments. The knowledge, information, and insights into human social behavior described in this book are based on the techniques and procedures discussed in this chapter. They are also based on the cooperation of tens of thousands of individuals who have allowed us to study their behavior in laboratories all over the world. We owe them a lot. Ultimately, our understanding of human beings in all their complexity rests on our ingenuity in developing techniques for studying behavior, which are well controlled and influential without violating the essential dignity of those individuals who contribute to our understanding by serving as experimental participants. What if our discoveries are misused? There is one additional ethical consideration: the moral responsibility of the scientist for what he or she discovers. Throughout this book, I have been dealing with some powerful antecedents of persuasion. This was particularly true in Chapter 3, where I discussed techniques of inducing self-persuasion, and in some of the subsequent chapters, where I discussed applications of these techniques. Self-persuasion is a powerful force because the persuaded never know what hit them. They come to believe that a particular thing is true, not because some demagogue or advertisement or Facebook friend convinced them it is true, but because they have convinced themselves. What's more, they frequently do not know why or how they came to believe it. This renders the phenomenon not only powerful but frightening as well. As long as I know why I came to believe X, I am relatively free to change my mind, but if all I know is that X is true, and that's all there is to it, I am far more likely to cling to that belief, even in the face of a barrage of disconfirming evidence. The mechanisms I have described can be used to get people to floss their teeth, stop bullying smaller people, reduce pain, or love their neighbors. Many people might consider these good outcomes, but they are manipulative just the same. Moreover, the same mechanisms can also be used to get people to buy particular brands of toothpaste and perhaps to vote for particular political candidates. In this era of political spin doctors, propagandists, and hucksters, isn't it immoral to use powerful techniques of social influence? As my readers must know by now, as a real person living in the real world, I have many values, and have made no effort to conceal them. They stick out all over the place. For example, if I had the power, I would use the most humane and effective methods at my disposal to end bigotry and cruelty. I am equally aware that, once these methods are developed, others might use them to achieve ends I might not agree with. Every tool we humans invent can be used for good or ill, to build or destroy. This realization causes me great concern. I am also aware that others do not share my values. At the same time, the phenomena I have been describing in this book are neither new nor solely the domain of social psychologists. After all, it was not a social psychologist who got Mr. Landry hooked on Marlboros or who invented lowballing. It was not a social psychologist who induced soldiers to justify the wanton killing of civilians. It was not a social psychologist who taught the Nazis how to use the big lie to manipulate the German citizenry. They did what they did on their own. Social psychologists are attempting to understand these phenomena and scores of others that take place in the world every day, and have been since time immemorial, the better to help people understand how and why we do what we do. This goal does not free us from moral responsibility. Our research often yields easily applicable techniques of social influence, and some individuals may use these techniques for personal gain, control over others, and even, in the hands of a demagogue, to turn our society into an Orwellian nightmare. It is not my intention to preach about the responsibilities of social psychologists in general. I can only specify what I believe to be my own responsibilities, to educate the public about how social psychological knowledge and techniques might be used for the greater good, to remain vigilant against the abuse of social psychological knowledge and techniques, and to promote good research aimed at furthering our understanding of us social animals, how we think, how we behave, what makes us aggressive, and what makes us loving. Frankly, I can think of no endeavor more interesting or more important.